At first glance, this film never looked dangerous. It appeared clean, effortless, almost weightless. Bright surfaces, confident characters, a story that seemed to glide forward without friction. For most audiences, it felt like a product of pure ease, the kind of movie that looked as if it had simply fallen into place. But that impression was a carefully constructed illusion. Behind the polished exterior, the production was anything but smooth. What eventually appeared light and controlled was born out of conflict, rejection, pressure, and a series of decisions that repeatedly pushed the project to the edge of collapse. Studio executives questioned its intelligence. Casting choices nearly rewired the entire story. Simple mistakes became permanent features. And moments audiences assumed were deliberate were, in reality, accidents no one had time to fix. This was not a safe production. It was a battlefield disguised as something harmless. The creative vision behind the film was constantly under threat, not from a lack of talent, but from competing ideas about what audiences were ready to understand. Every major choice carried risk. Every compromise threatened to flatten what made the story work. And at several points, the film came dangerously close to becoming something generic, forgettable, or quietly broken. What survived was not perfection. What survived was intention. The final version audiences embraced was shaped by resistance, misjudgment, and pressure applied from every direction. Its most iconic moments were not always planned. Some were preserved mistakes. Others were last-minute battles won behind closed doors. And a few existed only because someone refused to let go when letting go would have been easier. In this episode, we're breaking down 20 behind-the-scenes facts that expose the fragile reality beneath the surface. Not trivia for trivia's sake, but moments that reveal how close this project came to unraveling and why its success was never guaranteed. And there's one final story, a single message delivered at exactly the wrong time or the right one that quietly reshaped a career and altered Hollywood's expectations overnight. This is not the story you think you know. These are the details that were never meant to be noticed. Fact 1. The project was never meant to be a film. This story didn't begin as a movie. In its earliest form, it was designed for television, a format considered safer, smaller, and easier to control. The concept was pitched as episodic content, something disposable, something that could be tested and quietly canceled if it failed. Executives didn't just hesitate, they rejected it outright. The reasoning was simple and brutally revealing. The premise felt too clever for its own good. The tone didn't fit existing categories. And the idea of translating a structured literary framework into a contemporary setting sounded, to them, like unnecessary risk. What they saw was confusion. What they feared was an audience that wouldn't follow. Instead of abandoning the idea, the creator reversed the direction entirely. The rejected television structure was compressed into a feature-length script, carrying over its episodic rhythm while sharpening its focus. Scenes that once would have been stretched across multiple episodes were forced to stand on their own, creating a faster, more deliberate pace. Ironically, the very elements executives considered weaknesses became the foundation of the film's identity. The tight structure, the clean arcs, the sense that each moment mattered, all of it was born from rejection. Sometimes a project survives not because it's supported, but because it's forced to evolve under pressure. Fact 2. The lead was cast before anyone heard her speak. The actress who would define the film wasn't discovered through a traditional audition process. She wasn't chosen because of line readings or chemistry tests. She was chosen because of something far less controlled, her presence on camera. Before she ever stepped into the role, she had already been watched, studied in a completely different medium. Short appearances, minimal dialogue, heavy visual emphasis. Enough to prove one thing beyond doubt: the camera trusted her. Casting directors weren't looking for polish. They were looking for contradiction. Someone who could appear confident without arrogance, privileged without cruelty, shallow on the surface, but readable underneath. Her earlier performances demonstrated all of that without explanation. By the time formal auditions were underway, the decision was effectively already made. Other contenders read lines. She embodied the tone. The role didn't need to be built around her, it recognized her immediately. What followed was not instant certainty, but quiet commitment. A calculated risk on someone who hadn't yet proven she could carry an entire film. And that gamble reshaped not just the project, but the cultural memory attached to it. Sometimes casting isn't about talent alone. It's about recognizing the face that an audience will believe before they understand why. Fact 3. One of the film's most quoted lines was a real mistake. One of the movie's most iconic moments wasn't scripted, it wasn't rehearsed, and it certainly wasn't intentional. During a key scene meant to showcase the character's confidence and moral certainty, the actress mispronounced a crucial word, not subtly, not ambiguously. It was wrong in a way that would normally trigger an immediate cut, but the camera kept rolling. The director recognized something instantly. Correcting the mistake would have made the character sharper, cleaner, more competent. Leaving it in did the opposite, and that was exactly the point. The error revealed the gap between intention and understanding, between wanting to be right and actually knowing why. What could have been an embarrassing flaw became a defining trait. The mispronunciation wasn't mocked, it wasn't highlighted. It was allowed to exist naturally, transforming a simple line into layered characterization. The result was a moment audiences remembered, repeated, and quoted for decades, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest. In filmmaking, mistakes are usually erased, but sometimes the most truthful detail is the one nobody meant to create. Fact 4. The most important casting decision almost went the wrong way. One of the film's most recognizable performances came from a casting decision that nearly reshaped the entire story, and not for the better. The actor audiences now associate with intelligence and emotional grounding originally read for a completely different role. On paper, it made sense. The character was louder, flashier, more immediately visible. Casting directors believed his energy would fit better there. But something felt off. During auditions, the director noticed a disconnect. The performance wasn't wrong, it was simply misplaced. There was a restraint beneath the delivery, a seriousness that didn't belong to the character he was reading for. Instead of discarding him, the director did something riskier. She imagined him in a quieter role, one that required subtle authority rather than volume. That switch altered the film's emotional balance. The character he ultimately played became the anchor, the point of contrast that kept the story from floating away into self-parody. Without that grounding presence, the film's tone would have tipped too far into surface-level charm. This wasn't a lucky accident. It was a moment of restraint in an industry that often rewards exaggeration. One small casting shift prevented the entire narrative from losing its center. Fact 5. A future star came close to changing the film's identity. Before the final casting was locked, another actress stood one decision away from stepping into the lead role. At the time, she was largely unknown, talented, disciplined, and technically strong. Her audition impressed everyone involved. But something didn't align. The director sensed that the character, as written, required a very specific contradiction: confidence without calculation, charm without visible effort. The alternate performance was sharper, more controlled, and in a different film, it might have worked beautifully. Here, it would have changed everything. Had that casting choice gone through, the story would have leaned harder into satire and away from empathy. The character might have felt smarter, but also more distant, more deliberate, less instinctive. The decision closed one door and quietly opened another. While one actress became the face of a cultural moment, the other went on to build a career, playing variations of the same archetype just with different rules. In Hollywood, near misses are never neutral. They shape careers as much as the roles people actually land. Fact 6. The entire film was made under extreme time pressure. There was no luxury on this set. No extended experimentation, no indulgent reshoots. The entire production was compressed into a schedule that left no room for hesitation. 40 days. That was all. For a film with constant wardrobe changes, multiple locations, and ensemble scenes packed with movement and dialogue, the timeline was unforgiving. Every delay had consequences. Every missed beat carried forward. Paradoxically, the pressure worked in the film's favor. Actors were forced to commit quickly. Choices couldn't be overthought. Scenes were captured with a kind of immediacy that longer schedules often erase. The performances gained a natural rhythm, sharp, reactive, alive. The director had to trust her instincts without second-guessing. There was no safety net. What made it into the cut often wasn't the most polished version, it was the most honest one. The final energy audiences felt wasn't manufactured in post-production. It was a direct result of urgency. Sometimes speed doesn't weaken a film. Sometimes it strips away everything unnecessary. Fact 7. The story was built from real teenagers, not imagination. The dialogue didn't come from trend forecasts or pop culture guesswork. It came from observation. Before the script was finalized, the filmmaker immersed herself in a world most studios never bothered to study closely. She spent time around real teenagers from the environment the story claimed to represent. Not to mock them, not to exaggerate them, but to listen. What she found was unsettlingly specific. The confidence was real, but so was the ignorance. Political opinions were delivered with absolute certainty, even when they were factually wrong. Conversations jumped effortlessly between global issues and shopping plans without a sense of contradiction. The vocabulary felt invented, yet emotionally precise. Those details went straight into the script. This wasn't parody built from distance. It was satire grounded in proximity. That's why the characters never feel like caricatures. They feel recognizable even when they're wrong. The film didn't create a teenage voice. It preserved one that already existed. And that authenticity is the reason the dialogue still resonates decades later, long after trends have expired. Fact 8. A future iconic role was turned down as too small. One of the film's most memorable antagonistic presences almost belonged to someone else, an actress who would later dominate television and genre storytelling. The offer was made, and it was declined. At the time, her representatives believed the role lacked range, too shallow, too limited, not the kind of part that would showcase dramatic potential or justify the association. In their view, it was a distraction from more serious opportunities. The role went to another actress who approached it without restraint. What emerged was a performance that embraced pettiness, insecurity, and social aggression without apology. The character didn't need depth in the traditional sense. She needed clarity, and that clarity made her unforgettable. The decision to walk away didn't damage the other actress's career, but it redirected it. She found success elsewhere, in stories that demanded intensity and strength. Meanwhile, the role she passed on became a cultural reference point. In Hollywood, prestige is often misjudged in real time. Impact reveals itself later. Fact 9. One of the most famous scenes almost disappeared over money. The scene feels inevitable now, so integral that imagining the film without it seems impossible. But during production, it was nearly cut. The reason wasn't creative disagreement, it was cost. The technology required to execute the scene pushed the budget beyond what the studio considered reasonable. Executives questioned whether audiences would understand it or care. To them, it looked indulgent, decorative, unnecessary. The director disagreed. She understood that the scene wasn't about novelty, it was about control. It revealed how the character approached identity itself as something to be optimized, organized, and managed through systems rather than emotion. Removing it would have flattened the character's psychology. Keeping it required a fight. Time was short, money was tight, but the scene stayed. In hindsight, it did more than define the character. It predicted the future, a world where personal expression and technology would become inseparable. Sometimes the most unnecessary scenes are the ones that explain everything. Fact 10. A major audition failed for all the right reasons. One of the most recognizable actors of his generation walked into the audition room and failed completely, not because of lack of talent, not because of preparation, but because he brought the wrong truth. His performance carried weight, intensity, a seriousness that belonged to a different world. The story unfolding on screen required lightness, rhythm, and an unspoken understanding of privilege. What he delivered was grounded, working class, and emotionally heavy. It didn't fit. Casting directors remembered the audition not as a disaster, but as a lesson. Even great actors can be entirely wrong for a specific universe. Tone matters more than skill. Context matters more than range. The rejection wasn't personal, it was precise. Years later, that same intensity became the foundation of his career elsewhere, in roles that demanded grit and emotional gravity. Here, it would have broken the film's delicate balance. Sometimes failure isn't about ability, it's about arriving in the wrong story. Fact 11. A real accident made it into the final cut. The moment looked scripted, perfectly timed, almost too clean to be real. It wasn't. During a driving scene meant to communicate overconfidence, something went wrong. The car clipped another vehicle, not a prop, not a staged collision. A real mistake, captured in real time. The instinct on most sets would be immediate correction, reset, damage control. Instead, the director let it live. What mattered wasn't perfection, it was authenticity. The unscripted reaction, the panic masked by bravado, the sudden confrontation with consequences, all of it revealed the character more honestly than any planned stunt could have. The production paid for the damage. The scene gained something far more valuable. In a film built on control and image, a moment of genuine failure became one of its most truthful expressions. Comedy, at its best, doesn't come from exaggeration. It comes from letting people fail without protection. Fact 12. The wardrobe cost more than many entire films. The clothing wasn't decoration, it was architecture. Each outfit was engineered with intent, color, texture, silhouette, all communicating status, confidence, and emotional state before a single line was spoken. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was repeated without reason. The cost reflected that obsession. Individual pieces required constant alterations to maintain continuity under intense shooting conditions. Entire looks were rebuilt multiple times to survive wear, lighting, and movement. By the end of production, the wardrobe budget exceeded the total cost of many independent films released the same year. This wasn't indulgence, it was storytelling through design. Fashion functioned as dialogue, as power, as identity. Without it, the characters would have collapsed into generic archetypes. The film didn't just showcase style, it proved that visuals could carry narrative weight equal to words. Sometimes the most expensive choices are the ones audiences never consciously notice, yet feel immediately. Fact 13. One character was built from real people, not stereotypes. One of the film's most misunderstood characters wasn't written as commentary or token representation. He was constructed from observation. The filmmaker drew directly from people she knew, individuals who moved effortlessly through elite social spaces, understood the rules better than anyone else, and yet lived entirely separate emotional lives from the assumptions placed on them. They were charming, cultured, and unavailable in ways the protagonist didn't yet know how to read. That reality shaped the character. What could have become caricature was instead grounded in restraint. The character was never mocked, punished, or reduced to a lesson. He existed calmly, confidently, without explanation. His presence didn't disrupt the world of the film, it revealed its limits. For its time, that approach was quietly radical. The character didn't exist to shock audiences, he existed to be real, and that authenticity allowed the story to move forward without cruelty or embarrassment. Sometimes progress in cinema doesn't announce itself. It simply refuses to behave the way people expect. Fact 14. A visually expensive scene almost died in the editing room. Late into post-production, one scene hovered on the edge of removal. It wasn't flawed, it wasn't confusing, it was expensive. The set design, costumes, and coordination required for the sequence pushed the budget beyond comfort. Executives questioned its necessity. The scene didn't advance the plot in obvious ways. It didn't resolve conflict. On paper, it looked disposable. But the director saw something else. The sequence wasn't about story mechanics, it was about contrast. It placed two worldviews side by side, one built on surface pleasure, the other on cultural depth, and allowed the tension to exist without explanation. Removing it would have simplified the narrative. Keeping it preserved complexity. The scene stayed, not because it was flashy, but because it clarified character through environment. What people choose to enjoy says as much about them as what they reject. Some moments feel optional only until they're gone. Fact 15. The lead performance was carefully constructed, not natural. On screen, the confidence appears effortless. Behind the camera, it was anything but. The actress worked under constant pressure to embody a persona that required absolute certainty in posture, speech, and movement. Every gesture had to suggest comfort within privilege, even when the performer herself felt anything but comfortable. Preparation filled the gap. Dialect coaching refined the voice. Physical training shaped movement. Small habits were repeated until they became instinctive. What audiences interpreted as natural charisma was the result of disciplined construction. The irony was unavoidable. The character's supreme self-assurance was born from the performer's private insecurity. That tension gave the performance weight. The confidence felt convincing precisely because it was manufactured so carefully. Great performances often emerge from resistance, not ease. What looks most natural on screen is frequently the hardest thing to build. Fact 16. Filming in real locations created problems no one could control. The environment wasn't built for the film was forced to adapt to it. Several key scenes were shot in active public spaces, locations filled with real people who weren't extras and had no reason to behave like they were part of a production. Permits were limited, time windows were tight, security could only do so much. Interruptions were constant. Background noise broke takes. Unplanned movement entered frames. Crowds shifted unpredictably. The production had to choose between authenticity and control simply wasn't available. Rather than fight it, the director leaned in. The uncontrolled environment added texture. The world felt lived in, not staged. Social spaces looked chaotic in the same way teenage life actually is. What might have been cleaned up on a soundstage became raw, reactive, and real. The inconvenience paid off. Sometimes realism isn't created by design. It's captured when filmmakers stop trying to dominate the space. Fact 17. A supporting character grew after filming was already underway. Not every character arc was planned. One supporting role began as little more than a functional presence necessary for balance, but not essential to the emotional spine of the story. On paper, the character served a purpose and nothing more. Then chemistry intervened. As filming progressed, the natural dynamic between two performers became impossible to ignore. Their exchanges felt alive, unforced, sharper than expected. Scenes that were meant to pass quietly started drawing attention. The director noticed and adjusted. Additional moments were written, scenes were reshaped. In post-production, the character's presence was expanded through editing choices that emphasized reaction and rhythm. What started as secondary became integral. This wasn't indulgence, it was responsiveness. Great directors don't rigidly protect the plan. They listen to what the film is becoming. Fact 18. The source material nearly scared the studio into backing away. From the beginning, the film carried a literary foundation that made executives uneasy. The concern wasn't quality, it was perception. Studio leadership worried that openly acknowledging the source would intimidate audiences or suggest something academic, heavy, or inaccessible. There were discussions about minimizing the connection, even hiding it entirely from marketing. The director refused. She understood that the structure provided more than prestige, it gave the story internal logic. Character behavior made sense because it was anchored to a framework that had survived centuries. Removing that connection would have weakened the film's intelligence, even if audiences never consciously noticed its absence. In the end, the foundation remained. The irony was unavoidable. What executives feared would alienate viewers became the reason the story felt complete. Entertainment and intelligence were never opposites. They were only treated that way out of fear. Fact 19. The soundtrack nearly erased the film's identity. Music was never meant to be background noise. Early plans leaned towards safe, generic choices, tracks that would blend in, follow trends, and disappear quietly behind the images. On paper, it sounded practical. In reality, it would have stripped the film of its cultural fingerprint. The pushback came from within the creative team. The characters on screen weren't generic teenagers. They were privileged, informed, and socially aware in selective ways. Their music needed to reflect that contradiction, polished but slightly rebellious, familiar yet ahead of the curve. Fighting for alternative selections wasn't about taste, it was about accuracy. The final soundtrack captured a precise moment in time, one where underground sounds were crossing into the mainstream. Those choices didn't just support the film, they anchored it to a cultural shift. Without them, the movie would have aged faster. With them, it became a timestamp. Great soundtracks don't decorate films. They define how an era remembers itself. Fact 20. The film created a language without inventing one. The dialogue didn't feel written because it wasn't fabricated in isolation. Phrases that would later flood popular culture weren't created to be catchy. They emerged from pattern recognition the way real people used exaggeration, dismissal, and repetition to assert identity. Language became armor. A way to control conversations without confrontation. Each character spoke differently, not loudly, not randomly, deliberately. The vocabulary revealed hierarchy, insecurity, and belonging. It wasn't satire aimed downward, it was observation turned into structure. That's why the phrases survived. They weren't jokes, they were emotional shortcuts, and once audiences recognized themselves or people they knew in that language, it spread naturally. Cultural influence doesn't come from trying to be quoted. It comes from being accurate. Bonus fact, a single message quietly changed a career forever. The moment didn't happen on a red carpet. There was no announcement, no celebration. It arrived as a message. While the actress was already committed to another project, early audience reactions to the film triggered something rare: immediate industry confidence. The offer that followed wasn't incremental, it was transformative, a contract that reclassified her overnight. Timing was everything. Had the message arrived later, different commitments might have locked her into smaller paths. Had it arrived earlier, the film itself might not have had the same impact. Instead, it landed in a narrow window where momentum and opportunity aligned perfectly. Technology delivered the news. Chance amplified it. Careers are often explained as trajectories. In reality, they hinge on moments this fragile. The lasting impact of this film isn't fashion, dialogue, or nostalgia. It's proof. Proof that stories dismissed as lightweight can carry intelligence. That precision matters more than polish. That mistakes, when understood, can become strengths. What audiences saw as effortless was the result of resistance. What looked confident survived doubt, and what felt timeless was built under pressure. The most enduring films aren't flawless, they're resilient, and the stories behind them are always more complicated than they appear.